Hey everybody, we're going to cover the last set of notes for Chapter 8 today. This is a really quick set of notes covering two topics really, class attributes and static methods. So let's dive in. So you already should have your classy critter starter file set up in Replit. So with this, we've just got the class critter, the same example we've been using this entire time. A really simple example of this one where our critter just um, has one attribute, which is their name. Um, and then we're just going to use a critter with a name to model these two new ideas. All right, so get your starter file set up. And we'll first talk about um, a class attribute. So what I want you to do is right underneath our class header, we're going to make a comment about what a class attribute is. Right. So you're going to see it called a class attribute. You might see it called a static variable or a class variable. The name that you might see. But I'm going to refer to it as a class attribute here today. All right, so what this type of variable is, it's a variable that exists outside of your constructor. Remember, when you're using a constructor, you're constructing an object. So each individual object will get their own attribute. That's how we've set up all variables for our class. So our classes so far. So in this case, we've got an attribute that's existing outside of our constructor, which means it doesn't belong to a specific object. Rather, this variable does not belong to one object, but the whole class. So, but the entire class. In this case, we're going to have an attribute sitting up here. We'll call it total. We'll set it to 0. And I want you to think of this variable as just like we're going to keep track of the number of critters that exist. So when our class is defined, we'll say we haven't created any critters yet, so the total critters are 0. But every time we go ahead and create a critter, we're going to go ahead and update this value such that it keeps track of the critters ultimately. How do you create a critter? Well, the constructor runs, right? So inside of our constructor, we will increment total. You can see here as I'm typing, the syntax to do that is now, since we don't have an object, like a self, to access this particular type of attribute, we need another way to get at it. So the other way to get at it is by referencing the class name. So we'll reference our capital C critter to access this variable, and then we'll just increment it. Right, so that'll happen every time automatically when we go ahead and create critters. Right, so let's jump down to our main, and we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to access the class attribute. And one of the benefits of this is before we even have a critter now, we'll be able to access information about our class. So even before we have a critter, we can access our critter.total, and we can see information about our class. And here you can see 0. So we don't have any critters yet, but we already know that there are no critters, right? Because we have that variable telling us so. So then let's create a few critters. So I'm just going to give them super generic names here, not fancy at all. So 2 and critter 3. Okay, so we've got 3 critters that are created. And then let's go ahead and check out, make sure that our class attribute is updated. So we'll go ahead and afterwards print out the critter total. Awesome. So down here in the main, we can see we're creating some critters. So we've got 3 that get created. And then once they're created, our class attribute gets updated. And then we can re-access that by way of the class name here using our critter.total. All right, so that's topic 1 for today, class attribute. Second topic for today is now that you have this attribute that exists outside of any individual object, we've talked about how it's good practice to use methods if you're going to do an action like retrieve something, like we do for our getters. And same can apply for this scenario. So we have this attribute. If we're going to access this attribute, we can write a method to do that. Now, there's a lot of context for like why you might want to use this type of a method. But the example we'll use today is just we'll say if we want to access our total, maybe we should write a method to do that rather than access it directly like we did below. So the way you do this is by you write something called a static method. So it's a static method. Really similar concept, except for similar concept to class attribute, except for now we're talking about a method. So this is a special type of method, and it belongs to the class, not to any individual. Okay, so for a static method, there's something that you can use in Python called a decorator. And what this does is basically declare that you're about to write a static method. So it modifies following method and restricts object access. So it's a method that we only want accessible by the class. So there's not going to be any self reference for this type of method because it doesn't, it's not accessed through objects. So I'm going to call this a status. We're going to find out the status of our class, which will just be basically printing the critters. And I use a docstring here, so this is going to print total number of objects. Say total number of critters is critter.total. You can see I'm using that capital C critter to access my class attribute from the method as well. And also notice that there is no self required. And that's because this does not belong to a specific object. All right. And then the way we call this method, the way we invoke the static method is similar to the class attribute. We're going to do it using the class name. So we'll call the method on the class rather than on an object of the class. We want to figure out how many critters there are. You can see in our output here that our static method runs. Right? So tying very closely to a class attribute now, we've got a method that exists outside of objects. We've got a attribute that exists outside of objects, and these two can go hand in hand. So the method can call this attribute because neither of them require any objects. Right? And this last note here, access the class attribute through an object. This is something you can do. Like we said, there's some things you can do in Python that we wouldn't necessarily recommend. But just so you know, you may see it out there that you can access a total by way of an object. All right, since it belongs to the class, and this object comes from the class, the object is able to access it using this syntax here. So we can't actually get at the total. So we can print this out. Right? You can see that the objects can also see this information. Right? So it's not just the class that can see it. But using the syntax here, you cannot change the attribute using this syntax. Just access. Right? And that pretty much wraps up the notes. So quick one today. So just last two concepts for the unit, class attribute and static method.